If we think of that first section as cardiac anatomy and general structure of the vasculature, these are specific examples. These are specific routes. This is organization of the vasculature and a look at diagrammatic flow through the body. So like before, I'm setting out some objectives. One of these has been replaced by that fourth point in the last series that we didn't get to. So here we're going to learn about flow through the vascular system, which we've largely already done. We know the general pattern of flow, but we're adding specific names, places, locations, organs. We're identifying the major circulatory routes, and they're defining arteries and veins. And this is that fourth point from the last section that we're bringing in to this series of slides. Knowing those major arteries and veins, you will trace blood flow through to an organ and from an organ back to the heart. And where possible, so it's not a nebulous concept, I'll relate the path of these vessels to other structures that we know already. I'll relate them to the heart and major structures of the heart. I'll relate them to the brachial plexus, which you thought you could forget, but now it'll come back. We'll relate them to some of the bones that we've talked about already at length last semester. Things that should at least trigger your memory of potential locations in the body to understand how these are routed. Understand the setup and orientation of these major circulatory routes. Major circulatory routes. So, what do I mean by major circulatory routes? Isn't there just one major circulatory route? And you could argue that, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong. The heart pumps to the entire body and back. That's a major circulatory route. But in adding more detail, we want to break it down into usable chunks. And the first broad distinction in blood flow to the body occurs at the heart. There are two broad categories, or two broad destinations where the heart does pump blood. And the first is the pulmonary circulation, which we will see actually a lot later. Not a lot later, but later. And then the systemic circulation, the other 90% of the body. I think we already have an idea that pulmonary circulation describes the oxygenation of blood. Blood moving to be in contact with air from the environment, to offload CO2 and onload or load oxygen. What's interesting is that pulmonary circulation doesn't describe supply of blood to the lung tissue and the capillaries that allow the lung tissue to function. It's not the same thing. That's part of systemic circulation. And systemic circulation describes delivering blood to tissues for them to survive, to sustain normal function, and to deliver all nutrients required for that normal function. That includes the muscle, includes bone, some tendons, the lungs, the heart itself, the brain, all the tissues that need supply to function properly. Pulmonary circulation is what happens when the lungs function properly. So these major circulatory routes all run in parallel. There's no one route. There's one route to the body and back, but within the body, it depends on the organ of interest. The route that we're looking at depends on the organ or the system of organs or the region of interest. And so this diagram is, again, conveniently body-shaped. In fact, that last figure, that inset figure, I clipped from this diagram itself. It might look familiar if you focus here on the heart. Conveniently body shaped. We have the lungs, it looks like a head. There's some guts, a few appendages missing. But some candidates that we know already. So we know the heart in the middle, and we've already been introduced to pulmonary veins that supply blood to the pulmonary circulation and return blood to the heart via the pulmonary arteries. We know those well. Here we're seeing the pulmonary circulation, though. It's been a question mark up until now. That would be one major circulatory route. If we look up at the head, cranial circulation or cerebral circulation is another circulatory route. If I'm interested in the viscera and the intestines, I might move down in the body and note the celiac trunk, which is important for supplying the liver, the stomach, the spleen. That might be one circulatory route of interest. I might be interested in how food is absorbed from the intestines. That's another route altogether. Blood supplies the intestines, and we're going to see a really interesting deviation on these normal circulatory routes when we look at the portal vein, how nutrients are absorbed and delivered immediately to the liver, nutrients and otherwise. Implications for Friday night. Then there's the pelvis, reproductive system, another circulatory route. The lower limbs are down here. The upper limbs are conveniently missing. It's hard to draw those capillary beds with the lungs off to the side. But overall, conveniently body shaped, the heart is central. We see oxygenated blood in red, deoxygenated blood in blue. Deoxygenated blood, again, conveniently, all pools in the vena cava and or the coronary sinus. And so depending on the area of interest, we might focus only on the pulmonary circulation or the head or any of the visceral regions within the body. But they all maintain the same organization. Blood flow delivered on the arterial side, exchanged through the capillaries, and return through venous drainage. And here it looks circular. We have blood flow all on the right-hand side, moving down. You can see all of these individual arrows. They're moving in one direction only. They all move through a capillary bed, and they collect in veins and eventually return to the heart. Notice these systems are in parallel, so you don't need to wait for blood to go through the stomach before it gets to the lower limbs. You can do that at the same time. And also, don't take this at face value and assume that arteries are only on the left-hand side of the body and veins on the right. That's a simplistic description, but don't take it at face value. Often, veins will travel with the arteries. You'll see them in tandem. And so instead of a circuit, you can think of this almost as a U-turn. Artery perfuses an organ, the capillary bed is the U, and the vein goes back up in tandem with the incoming blood in the artery. So they often travel together. And it's not split right side versus left. That's overly simplistic. No one was thinking that, right? Good. One thing that I want to also point out before we leave this slide, we've got a couple more slides of class. Notice here, when we have this bird's eye view, all arterial blood is the same. All arterial blood is the same. If I were to take a sample from an artery in the leg and take a sample from an artery in the brain and I compared them, they'd be identical, or as close to identical as can be measured. Same hormones, same oxygen content, same glucose, same everything. That's all because the arterial blood has the same source. It mixes completely in the heart, and there's one point that distributes blood to the rest of the body, from the left ventricle to the aorta, and then it splits. That's a uniform sample of blood being distributed everywhere. All arterial blood is the same. Is all venous blood the same? I hear no, which is correct. Why? What's that? Because the body has different oxygen demands. That is correct in spirit. The organs within the body all work at a different metabolic rate. So they have different oxygen demands. They have a different input of CO2 and other byproducts into the blood. So depending on how active a certain area of the body is, it might have more waste products than another area of the venous circulation. The only place where all venous blood is equal is where? Where all venous blood is the same. Where's the only place in the body where that's true? Maybe two places. Pulmonary veins, okay, maybe three. Yeah. Pulmonary veins. Pulmonary arteries, not pulmonary veins. Taking blood away from the heart to the lungs. And pulmonary arteries, but it's arterial blood at that point. In the right ventricle, right? Where blood mixes. As soon as blood from the vena cava mixed together, blood from the rest of the body mixed together, the right atria, the right ventricles, it mixes, churns, makes a uniform sample. It's the only place where venous blood is the same, and or the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries as it goes to the lungs. Let's do a couple things here, because I know you know them and I can go through them quickly. Where does blood flow when it leaves the heart? Where does blood flow when it leaves the heart? The very first stop on blood's trip through the body is the aorta, specifically the ascending aorta. The aorta is broken into 4 sections by name, but it's the same vessel. We've called it the aorta until now. But the very first part of the aorta where blood is injected by the heart is the ascending aorta. From there, the aorta becomes the arch of the aorta as it candy canes back down to the heart, which incidentally is also Dr. Kane's nickname. I thought that would be funnier. You don't know him yet. When you meet him, it will be funny. Arch of the aorta becomes the thoracic aorta in the thorax, and you guessed it, the abdominal aorta in the abdomen. 4 parts of the aorta, but it's the same vessel. And the aorta only ends at the end of the abdomen when it divides into what's called common iliac arteries. And we'll come back to those later. I just wanted to point out to you where the aorta ends for now. First stop for blood leaving the heart is the aorta. One eye dotted. Okay, the aorta, major conduit. Major conduit with many branches. Where does it go next? What are the first branches encountered by blood as it leaves the aorta? And it's actually not shown here. Anyone remember the very first arteries to be supplied by new blood ejected from the heart? Aorta, and the very first branches off the aorta are very first branches. Talked about it last Friday, definitely in lab. As part of the quiz in lab, for those of you that had Tuesday labs. Very first branches sit in the pockets. Let me show you. What's that? Brachiocephalic is a good guess, and it's coming up in short order, but it's not the first, or it is not. There are two arteries that precede, that come before the brachiocephalic. Nope. The what? Coronary arteries, absolutely. So let's take a quick look. This is the aorta, right? Let's cut the aorta open. Okay? And I'm going to look down at the aortic valve, and you see that structure right in the pocket? Left coronary artery. Right coronary artery, you can see just poking over the top. Those are the very first arteries that blood encounters after it is injected into the aorta. Coronary arteries, of course, that supply the heart. Followed shortly thereafter by the brachiocephalic, which was our answer, which is not, it's technically wrong, but I get the spirit. It's the first major large artery that you'll see. But the absolute first are the coronary arteries, left and right. They sit in the pockets of the semilunar valve. So they're not shown here, and that's why I went through that exercise. What is shown here, if you start to trace this path, is the brachiocephalic trunk, followed very closely by the left common carotid and the left subclavian arteries. You've seen these in lab. They are major defining features, and I'm going to leave it there for today. We'll explore blood flow through the upper limbs and the head when we come back on Thursday a little bit, and then some turning point questions. It'll be a group activity. Make sure you register.